In my previous videos, I have been talking about slave trade, mainly focusing on the West, and am afraid that you might take this as a bias, since Arab traders were the pioneers of slave trade in Africa. In this video, I will focus on Arab slave trade in East Africa for you all. Buckle up, smash the subscribe button, and let me take you through a chronology of events which took place during the forgotten slave trade. As the world was turning its head on the slave trade to Europe, Americas, and the Caribbean islands between 1400 and 1800s, East Africa was bleeding. However, the antagonists were the Arabs. What's more intriguing is that it had been occurring from as early as the 7th century AD. There is limited information on the level of damage that took place in the coasts of Somalia, Kenya, Zanzibar, Mozambique, Comoro Islands, and down to Madagascar. The primary sources of information on the level of slavery that took place between the 17th and 18th century were the Portuguese. The Portuguese were not dealers or brokers of slaves in the coast. They had come to exploit the continent of its other resources, namely ivory and gold, but not slaves. But you might ask yourself, why was the demand for slaves in the Indian Ocean region sky high? Well, the Arab traders were looking for soldiers, dockers, sailors, servants, and for the women, concubines. And just to remind you, during this time, the Arab and Persian regions were thriving in agriculture, and as such, the slaves would come in handy in maintaining palm farms and managing the irrigation systems. A research called Slave Trade and Slavery on the Swahili Coast gives a comprehensive report on what happened between the 16th century and 18th century. As early as 1506, the Arab slave trade in the Malindi Coast, which represents the stretch from Mombasa to Mogadishu, were taking place. Arab merchants left the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, the Lamu Archipelago, Barawa, Mogadishu, the Comoro Islands, Madagascar, Zanzibar Island, Dar es Salaam, and Baru, among others, with a huge caravan of slaves. Besides taking slaves with them, the Arab exploiters left these coast regions with ivory, oil seeds, and rubber. Between the late 1690s and early 1750s, Oman, one of the Arab countries, became a crucial trader in East African slaves. The country which had sophisticated its agricultural sector and was in search of free labor, which they gained from the slaves sold to them. Oman's leader between 1692 and 1711, Imam Saif bin Sultan, owned between 700 and 1700 slaves who helped him tend to his coconut trees, date palms, and other crops. It was not the slaves who toiled in the farms alone obtained from African coasts. Estimates show that about 1,000 military personnel bearing African ancestry arrived in the Arabia regions as late as the 18th century every year. Efforts by the Portuguese to dominate the Indian Ocean trade was met with fury and brainstorms from the Arabs. For instance, in 1728, the Portuguese managed to take Mombasa from the Omans and free more than 2,000 slaves. However, the victory was short-lived since the Omans re-strategized and took back the island in 1729. Capturing the slaves. Just like the West African counterparts who sold slaves to the Europeans, the East Africans also did the same with the Arabs. I will use Kenya as a case study for the Arab slave trade. In Kenya, there is a town called Kitale. Kenyans might ask themselves, Kitale, slave trade, how? Kitale, located in the Rift Valley, was a center for slaves captured within and other parts of Kenya, and even Uganda. Once the slaves had been captured and brought to Kitale, the sorting process would begin. The sorting process would involve separating the males from females. Once they were divided, the males would have their heels bored with a heavy metal and shackled into a group of 3 to 10 men, depending on their numbers. They would then be castrated to prevent their offspring from increasing once they reached their destination. Should I remind you that most of these men, comprising of boys from as early as 13 years, died due to the excruciating pain incurred during the castration? You might also ask yourself, why castrate boys? Remember, the Arabs were strict and also hated blacks in equal measures. I will give you 3 possible reasons why the Arabs castrated their black slaves. First, the Arabs did not want any child sired by a black person. Second, they believed that a castrated person, who is referred as eunuch in the Bible, was obedient to his master, and would never sleep with his wife, mistress, or concubine. Third, they believed that a castrated slave was more powerful and would serve them longer. So what happened to the female slaves, one might ask? Well, they were not lucky either. They were never bound by chains like the male counterparts, but they still received a fair share of the brutality. They would be raped by their captors in Kitale and other collection centers, and any time the caravan stopped to relax. Many suffered severely and contracted STIs. Others died before they could set their foot to the coast regions. This happened throughout East Africa. But who was to blame for the Arab slave trade? First, the Arabs. They could have obtained cheap labor from their own, but then they wanted a cheaper alternative. Oh, I failed to mention, the Islam tradition prohibited the Arabs from enslaving one of their own. Second, Africans. An African is his or her enemy. I did not mention it, but then it is Africans who identified the potential slaves and captured them before selling them to the Arabs. And what did they get in return? Clothes, rice, weapons? That's silly. You might all say that the Arab slave trade ended and we should move on. I know you have heard of neo-colonialism, but is there a word like neo-slavery? Here is why. In the recent past, we have had incidences where our sisters, mothers, friends, and relatives, or people that we know, have been killed in Saudi Arabia. And who takes these girls to the Gulf region? Who own those agencies? You know the answer. As Africans, we can keep whining about slavery and its impacts on Africa, but we are the biggest antagonists to the continent. We enable these ills to continue haunting us, more than 50 years after gaining our independence. What are your thoughts about the Arab slave trade? Did you know that subscribing to a channel costs you nothing and takes less than a second? What's your excuse for not subscribing to this awesome content?